The Wayward Inn. Chapter 1. Arrival in Mist Haven. The wind howled like a ravenous beast as the travelers stumbled through the fog-choked streets of Mist Haven. The town was little more than a shadow, its presence swallowed by the thick gray mist that clung to everything like a living shroud. It was late, much later than he had intended to arrive, but the storm had blown in with a ferocity that made any attempt to continue impossible. Ahead, looming out of the fog, stood an old weathered inn. Its silhouette was jagged against the storm, the building seemingly cradled by the mist that swirled ominously around its base. A crooked wooden sign swung on rusted chains, squealing with each gust of wind. The Wayward Inn. The traveler shivered, though whether from the cold or the unsettling atmosphere, he couldn't tell. He hurried to the door, his soaked clothes clinging to him, and knocked 3 times. The sound echoed, swallowed quickly by the storm. For a moment, nothing happened, and the traveler felt an irrational surge of panic. Was the place abandoned? Had he made a mistake? But then, the door creaked open, and an old man with sunken eyes appeared in the dim light, peering out into the night with clear suspicion. His face was gaunt, his expression wary as if he were expecting someone or something else. "Room for the night?" the traveler asked, his voice nearly drowned by the wind. The innkeeper hesitated, his eyes scanning the street behind the traveler before nodding. "Aye," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "But it'll cost you more than coin, stranger. Storm's bad, worse than you know." The traveler gave a half nod, too exhausted to question the strange remark. He stepped inside, the warmth of the inn barely chasing away the cold that clung to his bones. The door groaned shut behind him, the sound eerily final. The inn was small and dimly lit, the furniture old and worn. A fire crackled weakly in the hearth, casting flickering shadows along the walls. There were no other guests in sight, no signs of life beyond the old man's cautious eyes. The air was heavy with the scent of mildew and something else, something faintly metallic, like blood. "Storm's a wicked thing out there," the traveler muttered, trying to make small talk. He rubbed his hands together, trying to warm them. "Came out of nowhere." "Aye, the storm," the innkeeper replied without looking at him. He shuffled toward the desk, pulling an ancient-looking ledger from beneath it. "The storm's one thing, but it's the fog you need to watch for. Creeps in, doesn't leave. Seen more than a few travelers go into it and never come back out." The traveler raised an eyebrow but said nothing. He chalked it up to local superstition. Small towns always had their stories. Still, there was an uneasy weight in the innkeeper's tone that stirred something inside him. It was unsettling how serious he seemed. "Second floor," the innkeeper rasped as he handed over an old brass key. "Last room on the left." The traveler nodded and made his way up the creaking stairs. The hallway stretched out before him, dimly lit and lined with old portraits of faces long forgotten. Each painting seemed to watch him as he passed, their eyes following him to the end of the hall. When he reached his room, he fumbled with the key, the door groaning as it opened. The room was modest with a single bed, a worn dresser, and a window that looked out into the swirling mist. The wind howled louder now, rattling the glass in its frame. He shut the door behind him, locking it out of habit. But even with the door closed, he could still hear something faint beneath the wind. It was almost like whispering. He shook his head, chalking it up to his tired mind playing tricks. The storm was fierce, and he had been on the road far too long. He needed sleep. Tomorrow he would head out and leave this strange place behind. But as he lay in the bed, staring at the ceiling, the unease lingered. The wind picked up, a banshee wail echoing through the night. The traveler pulled the blankets tighter around himself, but the feeling of being watched persisted. He glanced toward the window and froze. A figure, vague and shadowed, stood in the fog just outside. It didn't move, didn't flinch, as if it were waiting for something. His breath caught in his throat and his heart hammered in his chest. He blinked and the figure was gone, leaving only the swirling mist behind. Sleep, however, would not come easily that night. The storm raged on and the inn creaked and groaned like a living thing, its walls closing in as if the inn itself were alive. Something felt wrong, terribly wrong, but the traveler didn't know what. And deep down, He wasn't sure he wanted to find out. Tomorrow, he promised himself. Tomorrow he would leave. But as the storm pounded relentlessly outside, he couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had come with the fog wasn't finished with him yet, and neither was the Wayward Inn. Chapter 2. The Whispers in the Walls. The storm had not let up. In fact, by dawn it had only worsened, transforming the once mild breeze into a gale that shook the very bones of the Wayward Inn. The traveler lay in his bed, sheets tangled around his legs, eyes staring at the ceiling that seemed to sway with every gust of wind. Sleep had come only in brief, restless patches, and the sound of the wind hammering at the old windows was relentless. Worse than the storm, though, were the whispers. At first, he had thought it was the wind slipping through the cracks in the walls, producing soft, barely audible murmurs. But the whispers were too deliberate, too patterned. He had heard them in the dead of night, faint, indistinct voices just beyond the door, whispering in a language he could not comprehend. It was the sound of a conversation not meant for his ears, and that realization had chilled him far more than the storm outside. As morning light fought its way through the storm clouds, the traveler decided he could stand it no longer. He needed answers, needed to understand what was happening in this forsaken place. He dressed quickly, his clothes still damp from the previous night's rain, and descended the creaking staircase that seemed to groan in protest with every step. The inn's main hall was dimly lit, the fire in the hearth having burned low, casting flickering shadows on the stone walls. The innkeeper was there, as if he had never left his post. He sat behind the counter, his face gaunt and pale, the same wary expression etched into his features. His eyes met the traveler's as he approached, but the old man said nothing. "I didn't sleep much," the traveler began, trying to keep his tone conversational despite the tension gnawing at his gut. "This place, it's strange." The innkeeper said nothing, merely nodded, his gaze shifting to the window, where the fog clung stubbornly to the glass. "The storm's worse today," the traveler continued, leaning on the counter. "I think I'll be staying another night, but something's off. The storm, it's almost like it's alive, isn't it?" The innkeeper's eyes flicked back to him, a momentary flash of something, fear perhaps, passing through them before he quickly looked away. "Aye," the old man said at last, his voice low and gravelly. "Alive. That's one way to put it. What's going on here?" The traveler's voice was sharp now, the edges of his patience fraying. "This town, this inn, it doesn't feel right. I heard whispers last night. Voices." The innkeeper's eyes narrowed. "Voices?" "Yes, voices. Outside my room. What are you hiding in this place?" The old man was silent for a long moment, his lips pressed into a thin line as if weighing whether to speak at all. At last he sighed, the sound like air escaping from a tomb. "You should leave while you still can. The storm, it's nothing compared to what lies beneath." The traveler leaned in, his pulse quickening. "What are you talking about?" The innkeeper stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the stone floor. He moved to the window, his back to the traveler, staring out at the swirling fog that wrapped the inn in a suffocating grip. "This place has a history, you see, a dark one." The traveler remained silent, letting the old man speak. "Long before this inn stood here, long before Mist Haven was a town, this land was something else." The innkeeper's voice grew softer, almost reverent. "The people who lived here before, they practiced things, rituals, sacrifices. They believed the fog carried spirits, ancient spirits, and sometimes they'd offer people to the mist." The traveler felt a cold chill creep up his spine. "Offer people?" The innkeeper turned back to him, his eyes hollow. "Yes, to appease the spirits, to keep the fog from swallowing the town whole. But the rituals, they stopped. People grew afraid, started leaving, but not everyone could. Some of us are still bound to this place." The traveler swallowed hard, his throat dry. "Bound how?" The innkeeper's gaze darkened. "You'll see if you stay long enough." Before the traveler could respond, a loud crash echoed from the upper floor, followed by the unmistakable sound of hurried footsteps. The innkeeper's face paled, and without a word, he rushed toward the stairs, leaving the traveler standing alone in the dim hall. For a moment, he hesitated, debating whether to follow, but curiosity won out. He took the stairs two at a time, the old wood groaning under his weight. At the top of the stairs, he stopped, listening. The footsteps had stopped, but the air was thick with something else, something oppressive. It pressed down on him, making it hard to breathe. He glanced down the hallway and saw a figure, small, hunched, darting into a room at the end of the hall. His heart pounded in his chest as he cautiously approached the room, his hand reaching for the door handle. He pushed the door open slowly, the hinges protesting with a loud squeak. Inside, the room was dark, lit only by the faint light filtering in through a single grimy window. Dust floated in the air, disturbed by the figure that stood in the corner, facing the wall. "Hello?" the traveler called out, his voice echoing unnervingly in the small space. The figure didn't move. He stepped closer, his pulse quickening as he got a better look. It was a woman, her back to him, her hair long and disheveled, her clothes tattered and old. She stood perfectly still, her hands hanging limply at her sides. The air around her seemed colder, as if the very presence of the room was wrong. "Ma'am?" he said again, louder this time. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, the woman turned. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and unblinking, fixed on some distant point. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. And then, as if pulled by some invisible force, she began to whisper. The traveler stepped back, his heart pounding. He couldn't understand what she was saying. It was like the voices he had heard the night before, faint and garbled, as if spoken from a place far beyond the room they stood in. The woman's eyes locked onto his, and for the briefest moment, he swore he saw something flicker in them, something dark and ancient. Without warning, she lunged toward him, her movements jerky and unnatural. He stumbled back, his hands reaching out to steady himself against the wall. But she was faster than he anticipated. Her hands grabbed his wrists, her grip cold and impossibly strong. Her face was inches from his now, and he could smell the faint, metallic tang of blood on her breath. "Leave," she hissed, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Before it's too late." The traveler twisted free, pushing her away with a strength born of sheer panic. She fell to the floor, her body crumpling in a heap, unmoving. For a long moment, he stood frozen, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his eyes fixed on the still form before him. He waited for her to move, to rise again, but she didn't. His heart pounded in his ears as he slowly backed out of the room, pulling the door shut behind him. He leaned against it, his mind racing. What the hell had just happened? Who was that woman? And what was she doing here? He didn't have time to process it. The innkeeper appeared at the end of the hall, his face pale, his eyes wide with fear. "You need to leave, now." "What is going on here?" the traveler demanded, his voice shaking. The innkeeper didn't respond, simply grabbed him by the arm and pulled him down the stairs out into the storm. The wind howled around them, the fog thicker than ever. The traveler tried to pull away to demand answers, but the innkeeper's grip was like iron. "You don't understand," the innkeeper hissed. "The fog is alive. It's watching us. It wants you. It always wants someone." The traveler wrenched his arm free, stumbling back. "What are you talking about?" The innkeeper's face was gaunt, his eyes hollow. "You're marked now. You've seen too much. It won't let you leave." The traveler's blood ran cold. "What do you mean?" Before the innkeeper could answer, a figure emerged from the fog, its form barely visible through the swirling mist. It moved slowly, deliberately, its footsteps eerily silent against the wet ground. The traveler took a step back, his breath catching in his throat. The innkeeper's eyes widened in horror. "It's too late," he whispered. The figure stopped just short of them, its face obscured by the fog. But the traveler could feel its eyes on him, watching, waiting. And then, in a voice that seemed to echo from everywhere and nowhere at once, it spoke. "You don't belong here." The traveler's heart raced, his mind spinning. He wanted to run, to scream, to fight, but his body refused to move. The fog pressed in around him, suffocating, oppressive. He could feel it, crawling under his skin, sinking into his bones. The figure stepped closer, its presence overwhelming, and the last thing the travelers saw before the world went black was the innkeeper. Chapter 3. The Secrets Within. The rain drummed incessantly against the old window pane as the travelers stood by the small, grimy glass, staring out at the oppressive fog that smothered the landscape. The storm had settled into a steady rhythm, but the fog, the cursed fog, remained a constant presence, lingering like an uninvited guest. The inn's walls groaned as though straining under the weight of something unseen. He couldn't shake the feeling that the building itself was alive, watching him, waiting for him to make the wrong move. The events of the previous day still lingered fresh in his mind. The strange woman's whispered warning, the innkeeper's cryptic words, and the fog-cloaked figure that had spoken with a voice as old as the earth itself. His heart pounded every time he replayed the encounter, and yet, despite the fear gnawing at his nerves, he couldn't leave. Something rooted him here, compelled him to uncover the truth, to pull back the layers of darkness that shrouded Misthaven. His eyes drifted toward the door to his room, to the narrow crack beneath it, where the faintest light bled into the hallway beyond. He had locked it last night, but that offered little comfort. The whispers had returned as he lay in bed, though fainter this time, as if receding deeper into the shadows of the inn. The innkeeper had not spoken to him since pulling him from the upstairs hallway, and the traveler could not shake the feeling that the old man knew far more than he let on. He moved toward the door, pulling it open with a creak that sounded far too loud in the silence. The hallway stretched out before him, dimly lit and heavy with the scent of damp wood and mildew. The portraits that lined the walls seemed to watch him, their faces grim and hollow, their eyes flickering with the firelight from downstairs. A cold draft drifted through the hall, raising goosebumps on his arms as he walked, each step sending a soft echo that seemed to linger far longer than it should. He had to find answers. His feet carried him back downstairs to the main hall, where the innkeeper had once again resumed his station behind the counter. The old man didn't look up as the traveler approached, his eyes fixed on the ledger before him, as though the task of reviewing its yellowed pages was the only thing keeping the world at bay. "I need to ask you something," the traveler began, trying to keep his voice steady. The innkeeper didn't respond. The traveler took a deep breath, forcing himself to continue. "Last night, that woman, who was she?" The innkeeper's hand froze mid-page turn, but still he didn't look up. "Was she real?" the traveler pressed, "or am I losing my mind?" Finally, the innkeeper raised his head, his sunken eyes meeting the traveler's. "Real enough," he muttered, his